Most students believe that Jews went like sheep to the slaughter. They perceive the Holocaust as a piece of Jewish history only about victimization and the loss of hope. The experience of thousands of Jewish partisans who stood up to tyranny and oppression, fought successfully against the Germans, and saved countless lives is an important part of Jewish history that few students are aware of. This is a quote from the Jewish Partisan Educational Foundation's book, Teaching with Defiance, by Maya Bernstein. It describes the ignorance of those who do not realize that the Jewish people resisted against the Nazis. The Jewish partisans were armed forces that focused mainly on helping Jews in the rescue and escape, aid in hiding, and spiritual resistance during World War II. A partisan is someone who is a strong supporter of a certain party, cause, or person. They are normally associated with being a member of a resistance group formed to fight an opposing force. Most Jewish partisan resistance groups formed after 1942, but didn't begin opposing the Nazis until 1943, as they had to wait for favorable circumstances such as a more sympathetic population. They faced obstacles such as lack of training, fear of Nazis, anti-Semitism, and the hardship of leaving their families behind. They operated in forests mainly behind enemy lines near villages as guerrilla warfare fighters. However, due to the villagers' fear of Nazi punishment, they weren't able to receive any help from them. Jewish partisans were not fighting for an ideal such as nationalism or anti-fascism. The Jewish partisans were fighting for their lives. This quote from the Shoah Research Center's article on partisans describes the rationale for Jews forced to become partisans as they were struggling to survive during the Nazis' reign of terror. Jews wanting to become partisans had to escape from their ghettos and go to the forests to find a partisan base willing to let them in.
They gave them conditions. The conditions were that you had to bring your own ammunition, your own equipment, a rifle, a gun, grenades, or whatever. You cannot get from the unit.
Forests in Eastern Europe were an ideal place for the partisans to regroup, as many Jews knew the territory well, and the thick woodland and many swamps served as cover for ambushes. But despite the many advantages these forests provided, the partisans still faced conflicts. Perhaps the biggest struggle the partisans faced was the shortage of food. They would try to find friendly farmers and townspeople to supply them with resources. But when that was unavailable, they would steal food or take from abandoned storehouses. Some unfriendly people would even go as far as to expose them to German authorities or local police. There was always the fear of the authorities discovering them. All adults had to take up guard duties except for the sick, handicapped, and elderly. Small squads risked their lives in dangerous missions to save other Jews from ghettos. But in order to protect themselves, the partisans needed weaponry. Friendly peasants and other partisans gave them weapons, but they also acquired them from attacks against German troops and outposts. The Jewish partisans also encountered uncontrollable events, such as the weather. They struggled with keeping members from freezing to death in the winter. To compensate for this, they created insulated structures by cutting down trees and digging holes. They also used campfires to keep themselves warm and to cook food. They packed their roofs with dirt, branches, and vegetation to camouflage themselves from intruders. Many Russian partisan groups formed nearby due to the attacking Germans and the retreating Red Army. They were suspicious of the all-Jewish groups as they were mostly non-combatants. Therefore, they often competed for land. Despite the fact that they wanted to help their fellow Jews, they faced the dilemma of how many non-combatants were allowed to join the group. With the increasing amount of members, the chances of being found grew, and the food rations began to dwindle. Many Jews fled to the forests when the Germans launched mass murder campaigns in Belarusia and the Ukraine during the second half of 1941. Therefore, Belarusia had the highest concentration of partisans in Eastern Europe. By 1944, there were about 374,000 partisans operating in the forests in Belarusia. Even with the anti-Semitic atmosphere around them, they still managed to fight the Germans, with the Jewish partisan resistance forming over 100 ghettos in Poland, Lithuania, Belarusia, and Ukraine. As the Germans attempted to abolish major Jewish ghettos, they met with armed Jewish resistance in Krakow, Bialystok, Czestochowa, Bedzin, Sosnowiec, Tarnow, and the Warsaw Uprising. Thousands of Jews escaped from these ghettos and into the forests, where they could form and join the partisans.
That's just the way it goes. It's part of it. Part of life. And don't forget, this is better than a concentration camp.
Family camps were locations where Jewish civilians could assist the armed forces by repairing weapons, sewing clothing, and cooking food for the fighters. At least 10,000 Jews survived World War II by taking refuge in these camps. They were established in western Belarusia, western Ukraine, and eastern Poland. In Western Europe, a Jewish partisan group called the Jewish Army formed in Talas, France in January 1942, but operated in Paris, Nice, and Lyon. Their members were trained in military and sabotage activities and formed close ties with Allied forces. They smuggled money from Switzerland to France to fund the Jewish efforts to hide and took part in Jewish uprisings against the Germans. They smuggled at least 500 Jews and non-Jews over the border into Spain, where it was neutral and safe, and they assassinated people that supported the Germans. It's estimated that 20,000 to 30,000 Jewish partisans fought in World War II, with the majority fighting in Soviet-controlled areas. However, it is hard to know the exact numbers, as they usually kept their identities a secret due to anti-Semitism, and the small amount of resources made it difficult to keep records. The Allied forces, such as the British and Americans in Greece, France, and Belgium, supported the partisans since they worked behind enemy lines against the Axis powers. They had strategic value and worked with them whenever they could, but the Soviet units, even though they were a part of the Allied forces, usually discriminated against many of the all-Jewish partisan groups and cut them off some supplies due to anti-Semitism. The Warsaw Uprising was the largest and most symbolic Jewish uprising. It started on April 19, 1943, when the Germans began deporting surviving Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto. Previously, between July and September 1942, German authorities began to liquidate the ghetto by deporting or killing over 300,000 Jews. They granted only 35,000 to stay in the ghetto, but 20,000 other Jews lay in hiding. During the deportation in July, several underground Jewish groups formed a self-defense unit commonly known as the Jewish Combat Organization. Together with the Jewish Military Union, despite initial tension, they agreed to work against the attempts of German efforts to abolish the ghetto. It was only in April that the Germans decided to finish what they started and deport the surviving population to forced labor camps in the Lublin district of the general government. However, the Germans were forced to retreat due to the armed Jewish resistance. But the Germans proved themselves too powerful for the Jews, as they broke any organized military Jewish resistance within a few days of the uprising. Small groups or individuals managed to hold off the Germans for a month, ending on May 16th. By this time, the Germans successfully crushed the uprising and left the ghetto in ruins.
Narrow corners, ideal cover for snipers and the underground fighters, took the Germans a month to capture.
This inspired other ghettos, such as Bialystok and Minsk, to form resistive movements against the Germans, allowing those to escape to the forest and join the Jewish partisan movement. The largest all-Jewish partisan group was the Belsky brothers. They operated in the Naliboki forest of Stankovic, Poland, and consisted of 1,200 people, including the partisans and family camp. Tuvia, Asael, Aaron, and Zeus Belsky started the group after their parents and two brothers were killed by the Germans in the Novogrudek ghetto in December 1941. Tuvia formed the family camp and allowed women, children, and the elderly to join, unlike most other groups.
In ghetto we knew that there is a Tuvia Bielski, that he wants young, old, sick, children. He didn't care. As long you are a Jew, you have to come, you have to survive.
The group reached its peak of 1,230 people, with more than 70% being women, elderly, and children, who otherwise would have perished under the German rule. In order to keep the large amount of people in check and suppress conflict within the group, the Belsky maintained a strict military-style rule, as it was their best chance of survival, and it kept the group unified. They were one of the few groups that allied with Soviet partisans, which were comprised of Red Army soldiers who fled and hid after Germany's invasion of Poland in June 1941. Overall, the Belsky group was one of the many Jewish partisan groups that operated in World War II and that had made a difference in the lives of many Jewish people and families. Though the Jewish partisans took a stand and saved thousands of lives, overall they did little to stopping the Nazis from inflicting mass genocide on the Jews. But together, they were the biggest form of Jewish resistance against the Nazis and took a stand against oppression in World War II.